So last week, did y'all get retirement all figured out between last week and this week? Did the homework, got the plan, all set until you predicted your own death? Remember, that was part of the exercise. You had to say, 94, no, 107 if you're, if it's longevities in your family, or 85. What's that? There's Mike's retirement plan. Keep going until you die. So we had that last week, and I know that some of that was technical, and that's just the nature of it. But I also think that it's a good practice of stewardship and working through some of that. And again, as a review of all of that, maybe you just came to the place where you said, you know what, I really need to talk with a financial advisor. Probably one of the best things you'll do, some of the best money you'll spend, as long as you get a good guy. So this week, we're going to kind of transition a little bit into the area of giving, and I've called it Giving God's Way. So we're going to talk a little bit about giving scripturally and what the Bible has to say about it and where the idea of a tithe comes from, and we're going to look at some of that background and try to come up with a biblical understanding of what giving should really look like as we've talked about finances in the believer's life, from budgeting and debt payoff and all of this stuff. Where does giving really fit in? What does it look like? And the traditional idea of tithing 10%. What does that look like scripturally? Where does that come from? We're going to talk about all of that. And so I was reading an article recently that said the people who believe in tithing are in one of three places: retirement homes, nursing homes, or graveyards. Was what this, I think it was a John Piper article on Desiring God, and thought, that's probably true. There's a different generation coming along, and this particular article attributed a lot of it to the success of the American economy, especially after World War II, kind of hitting harder with the baby boomer generation, and then even harder on after that, so that even millennial generation stereotypically does not give very well in church, in congregations. And that trend is true also of the cooperative program with the Southern Baptist Convention. It's really been one of decline in recent years. And so, where my heart is that we would just really understand what giving is and fight against the impulse to get for ourselves, right? So my great-grandma, her name was Opal Richwine, great-grandma Opal, passed away probably 15 years ago or so, and we were going through her stuff. We uncovered, I think it was 6 months worth of tithing envelopes and checks already made out to the church. Really just to reinforce this idea that there was a generation that really believed in, taking that first 10%. It doesn't matter what the budget looks like. She was, of course, on a fixed income and all of that, and maybe a little more predictable than some budgets and all of that. But really, there's an element of heart surrender involved to be at that place, and also there's an aspect of stewardship to really be at the point where you have your personal bills under control, where you can get to that place of surrender and flexibility to be able to give that generously, that frequently, and that consistently. So I really want to, dive into the issue, lay some of the groundwork. This idea of tithing, there's some spade work, okay? So we're going to dive into some of the spade work here, and we're going to talk about a couple of things. The Old Testament tithe, where that came from, and then the Old Testament versus the New Testament, and giving in the Old Covenant versus the New. So some technical details there to uncover. Then we're going to talk about how much should today's Christians give. And then we're going to wrap up with a couple concluding thoughts. Okay, so we're going to do the spade work first. We can kind of dive into the Old Testament law and understand this concept of giving in the Old Testament, especially the word tithing, where that comes from and what that means. And then we're gonna look at some New Testament passages as well. So if you read back through the law, I'm actually reading through Leviticus right now in my devotions, and it's one of those things. It's like, man, I'm gonna get through this gonna get through it, reading through all the commands and everything. But actually, there's some really interesting things in there when you really put your mind down to it and you're understanding it. And as I continue to grow in my walk with the Lord, I get more excited to read through the Old Testament and understand how it applies to the New. One of the things you'll come across is tithing that was required by the Mosaic Law. In Numbers 18, we have the first commanded tithe. There's also a reference to it in Leviticus, so it really comes up in a couple places. And it says this, "For the tithe of the people of Israel, which they present as a contribution to the Lord, I have given to the Levites for an inheritance." And just to catch you up on the whole passage, when Israel was given its land, it was divided up and each tribe got a portion, right? The only tribe that did not get a portion was who? The Levites. And here in this passage, we understand that they have a different role. The Levites have a different role. They have a different inheritance, and there was a tithe set aside just for the Levites so that they could perform the function of the Levitical priesthood in the Mosaic Law for the nation of Israel. So they were given a tithe. This word literally means a tenth. So that's this idea in the Hebrew. The tithe means a tenth. And so actually you come across another passage and you come across this idea of tithing again. And here's Deuteronomy 14, "You shall tithe all the yield of your seed that comes from the field year by year." And remember, these are commandments of the nation to tithe, the nation of Israel to tithe. This is actually a second annual tithe, so a second annual tenth. So how much are we at now? 20%. And this one was specific to festival and temple events, so these special occasions and feasts that they had, they were also required to contribute towards these events as well. Keep reading. "At the end of every third year," oh no, it's another tithe, "you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce, and the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow shall come and eat and be filled." So there is a third tithe. And this one happens only every third year. But this one is specifically a tithe to the poor. So in total, this is really when it comes to tithing and offerings, the Old Testament was not giving 10%, right? They were giving more than that. Some years they were giving 30%, some years maybe 20%. And so you could kind of annualize out that every third year, that 10%, and maybe average out like 23, 24% just on these tithes. Now, there are other laws that said don't harvest the edge of your fields, right? You remember these passages? Don't harvest the edge of your fields because the poor will come and take those. And so there's actually another kind of percentage for the poor, kind of rake that off. And then even there are commands, if like a bale of hay falls off your wagon, leave it behind for the poor to gather. So there's even more greater ideas and lots of tithing and giving in the Mosaic Law. It would be disingenuous to say, well, they tithe in the Old Testament, so let's tithe in the New Testament. Because they're actually giving a significant portion of income. And so for Israel and the nation in the Old Testament, their situation was a little different. And we're going to look at a couple of things here. So firstly, Israel was a theocracy. What does that mean? Somebody give me the definition of a theocracy. Yeah, it's really, we have this big idea of the separation of church and state here in our modern concept. Well, this is a complete violation of that. It's a combination of church and state. There are theocracies in place in the world today, like Saudi Arabia, Iran. These would be ideas of theocracy, where the police are also religious leaders. And so they're enforcing law, they're enforcing religious law and civil law. It's a combination of religion and government altogether, and this is what the nation of Israel had at the time as well. God had set up the original government, right, for himself to be the focal point, for God to be the king of Israel. And we know that that changed over time. So really the theocracy in the giving of the people, there was the tithes given to the Levites who performed the religious function. They also performed a civil function. So they're actually carrying out civil government. They're dealing with lawsuits. The priests are dealing with restitution if you harm your neighbor in some way or you lose his property. These are all issues of civil government. These are not necessarily moral issues, but they are all handled by the same governmental function of the Levites. And then, of course, also there was this idea of supporting the poor. Think, welfare in our modern concept. There is also this idea of giving to the poor. So the government and the tithing and the contributions were all put together in this one idea. And really, in our modern heads, what we're thinking is that sounds a lot like, taxation. That sounds like they're giving to support the government, or actually required, as the law required to give, just like we're required to pay taxes. But then there's also this idea that they're giving towards the religious function. So there's giving for the religious function, there's giving for the governmental function. It's all a big basket. And really, you think about the percentage-wise that they're giving, it sounds similar to the percentages that we have in our tax tables today. You're going to be ranging between 15 and 30%, depending on your income. Most of us in the 20%, somewhere in there. And that's very similar to the kind of system they had set up there. So when we really dive in and lay the spade work in the Old Testament, you think, well, we're kind of in a different situation today, right? We're in a different situation than the Mosaic Law. And of course, and I'm going to make this one large, giant assumption that we're all on the same page with being no longer under law, but under grace. We could do an elective study of 6 weeks or more on that concept alone. But just to highlight this really quickly, that we're no longer under the Mosaic Law. And Romans 7:4 says, "You also died to the law through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to another, to him who has been raised from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit from God. But now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve in a new way of the Spirit, and not in the old way of the written code." So when you read through the Old Testament, you understand that we're not necessarily following the written code there. And Paul has laid out the theology for that in the book of Romans, and also probably Galatians. You could look at and understand that. For now, we're going to take the assumption that we're all understanding this concept. We're not following necessarily the same exact Old Testament prescription for tithing. So what is the New Testament idea? What do we give in the New Testament? What applies to us specifically today? Well, there's a couple of passages, a number of passages we could look at, but I'm going to lay out kind of the idea of what is it that we give today and why, okay? So I'm going to look at 1 Corinthians 9. There's a couple of principles to pull out of here. The Apostle Paul says this, "Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple?" He's talking about the Old Testament, right? "And those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings. In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel." So he's supporting this idea of that Old Testament concept. The people gave so that the priests could carry out the religious function and live on that. And he's taking that concept in the New Testament and saying, if there are people who labor in the gospel, you should do what you can to support them so that they can do that. So we're talking pastors and missionaries, right? Giving to support those people so they can spend their life doing the work of the gospel. What he does not say is give a specific percentage of your income. But he does say give to support that idea. Really, the principle in the New Testament is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So there is an idea for us as believers that giving is no longer, it's not like, you just whip out this checklist of duties and you go, okay, I went to church, okay, did my Bible reading, gave 10%, okay, I have a righteous standing before God, right? That's what the law was trying to do, is give you an idea of everything you had to do so you could be right before God. And just like Romans 7 said, that held us captive because we couldn't attain it. We couldn't do it. Nobody could do it. Just told us how wicked we were and how far we fell short. The principle in the New Testament is really more of a heart issue. You can give 10% of your income and you can have a lousy heart attitude, can't you? And you could give more than that, or you could give less than that, and your heart could be in a different place. You understand, the principle of the New Testament is not necessarily about a percentage so much as it is about your heart attitude. We don't actually read a specific percentage of income to be raked off the top. we have this principle: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So if you take that passage in a word, how should you give? Bountifully. Bountifully. Next verse. Each one must give as he decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So how much are you giving? This is a conversation that you and maybe your spouse have, and how much do we want to give? What are the needs out there? What is our current situation? And this is something that we learn in the New Testament. Each one must decide with the principle of sowing bountifully and giving cheerfully. And these are all things that we should do. I grew up in a background that really hit the 10% tithe really hard, so much so that I don't know that this was ever specifically said, but I just kind of grew up thinking, if I give 9%, I'm sinning. If I give 10%, I'm doing what's required. If I give 11%, I'm going above and beyond. I'm kind of reaching that extra step of holiness is kind of how I thought of it. And it's not what we find in the New Testament. The 10% tithe really up to this point in our day and age has been a way of honoring an Old Testament concept. Like the Apostle Paul took the concept and he applied it. Just like in the Old Testament, there was giving to support the Levites who performed the religious function. Also give to support the gospel in our current age. So he's taking that concept and giving 10% is a way of honoring that concept. But I honestly think that the New Testament doesn't say give 10% because it would be limiting, right? You come up and you say, I've got all kinds of extra money. If I give 10%, I can go spend the rest however I want, right? If that's all it's required, I'll just give my 10% and I'll spend the other 90% and just live it up, I'll spend it all on me. And meanwhile, there's needs. There's needs out there. There's needs for the gospel. There's needs for the poor. I'm going to tell you, part of my function in the church is to deal with benevolence issues. So in other words, when somebody has a financial need, they come to me. And I have to work through that. And there are more needs. There are always more needs than there are funds. Always more needs than there are funds. So giving to support the poor and giving a percentage, really we need to be thinking about giving bountifully, assessing the needs and what are the needs and how can we help to meet those needs rather than just, I'm just going to check this box off. Okay, obedience, 10% equals obedience. And that's not necessarily what Jesus had in mind when he laid out the idea of giving in the New Testament. It was about a heart attitude, and Paul really talks about it here, giving cheerfully, giving bountifully. Did that rock your world? When I kind of uncovered this and studied it, it rocked my world. Like, what? I always thought, man, you just take the 10%. I heard somebody say, well-meaning person, say, God has given you all of this, and all he's asking back is 10%. And so then from there on, I started thinking, well, God is asking for that 10% back. And then, the rest of it is mine to live off of. But really, God's not just asking for 10% of you or your income, is he? How much is he asking for? That's it, 100%. But the New Testament lays it down differently, and we understand it's all about a heart attitude. And it's not so much just check off that level of obedience. It's, I want to do everything I can to support the gospel in the world around me and to meet the needs of the poor. And however much I can give to that effort is how much I'm going to give. And that's really where you come down. And just like this verse says, each one must decide in his heart where that is. That can mean there are times in your life where the budget's tighter. If you got 6 kids running around the house, that's going to look a little differently than maybe somebody who's at the top of their income. Kids are kind of on their way out, and you're financially flexible, and you have the ability to give above and beyond it. That's what you should do. That's what you should do. And then just to reinforce the idea of giving to the poor in the New Testament, we have examples of this. 1 Corinthians 16, the Apostle Paul is trying to raise funds for some poor and persecuted believers in Jerusalem. And he says, on the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And he's going to collect these funds from this one church, and he's going to take them to Jerusalem. And this is the ideal, international missions is really what's at heart there. And if you're giving at New Prospect, one of the things that I love about giving here in Southern Baptist circles is that a percentage of every dollar that you're giving is going to international missions, because we participate in the cooperative program, and that's going to be international missions, that's going to be North American missions. So just giving in the offering plate at church here, we do the best we can with that money to support above and beyond global missions, because we believe that supporting the gospel wherever we can is a biblical mandate for us as believers today. So there's also this idea of collecting for the poor. We have a percentage of our budget. A percentage is really a dollar figure of our budget that's called benevolence, that we use specifically to help people in need. And so these are all things that in the New Testament we should be giving towards. So let's move into some concluding principles here. Firstly, we're supporting the gospel, giving wherever you can to support the gospel, whether that's missionaries in another field, whether that's pastors, whether that's somebody doing a localized mission of some kind that you can give towards. You're giving to support the gospel. You're paying taxes. I didn't cover this passage, but you know that you do need to be giving taxes. You need to be paying your taxes. How does that old saying go? Good Christians should avoid tax avoidance, and there's tax aversion. When one of them's illegal, right? Which one's illegal? Is it tax aversion? Tax aversion's that's the crime, right? So you should avoid taxes, not avert them. Well, whatever. Pay your taxes is what I'm trying to say. Give to the poor. Give to the poor is another idea that we have here. Giving to the poor in Jerusalem on a regular basis is an example that we see in the New Testament. Give bountifully and cheerfully. So it's not like, first of the month, I got to give my 10% tithe. Such a bummer. I could really use that money for my Caribbean vacation or to pay my car bill. And then giving that 10%, really, this is an idea that's existed today really as a way of honoring, like we talked about, honoring that Old Testament concept of giving a tithe. But it's not necessarily come down where the rubber meets the road, that somehow if you're giving 9%, you're disobedient, or somehow if you're giving 15%, well, you've got a really great heart. The idea could be flip-flopped. You could be giving 9% with a great attitude and a great heart attitude, and that's where you are in your budget. Or you could be giving 15% and kind of have a lousy attitude about it, right? Okay? So that's just kind of where that's where the New Testament has us. Give regularly. The gospel is an ongoing effort. We should always, as we have the ability, be supporting regularly. And then finally, be a wise steward. So we're not, I think really, a fault of my previous view that I mentioned was really that I could take that 90% and I could just consume all of it. Just consume. As long as I gave that 10%, the rest free to do whatever I want. If I could afford the house, the bigger, whether I need it or not, go for it. If I could afford the car with that 90%, go for it. As long as I'm giving that 10%, everything else, that's clear and free. And really, I have down here in the note, giving generously is inhibited by entitled and luxurious lifestyles. And really, just to hammer that point home, I've pulled out an example from the life of John Wesley, and I found this particular example to be pretty convicting. So John Wesley, the preacher, he lived in the 1700s, one of the great evangelists. In 1731, this would have been when he's close to 30 years older, just thereabouts, he began to limit his expenses, that he would have more money to give to the poor. In the first year, his income was 30 pounds, and he found he could live on 28. So he gave 2 pounds. And if you're thinking about percentage, that's a little under 10%, okay? A little under. and he gave away 2. In the second year, his income actually doubled, but he held his expenses even, and so he had 32 pounds to give away, which was a comfortable year's income. So he gave away a comfortable year's income that year, in his second year of this idea. In the third year, his income jumped to 90 pounds, and just the same, he kept his expenses low, and he gave away 62 pounds, so essentially giving away 2 years' worth of income that year. In his long life, Wesley's income advanced as high as 1,400 pounds in a year, but he rarely let his expenses rise above 30 pounds. He said that he seldom had more than 100 pounds in his possession at a time. So baffled by this were the English tax commissioners that they investigated him in 1776, insisting that for a man of his income, he must have silver dishes that he was not paying excise tax on. And he wrote to them, "I have 2 silver spoons at London and 2 at Bristol. This is all the plate I have at present, and I shall not buy any more while so many around me want bread." So I think that, the concept there's a man who's living out this idea of giving generously, keeping his expenses low. He's not consuming, even though he has the ability. Hey, let the expenses rise a little bit as your income rises, right? John Wesley was very, very successful in his lifetime, but he really used that in a way that he could give as much as he possibly could to support the gospel, living on less, and living well below his means. And not just having this concept of, as long I've got this 90% and I can consume all of that if I want to. He really saw the needs around him and said, it's not right for me to just consume and consume and consume. I need to be focused on the gospel. I need to be focused on giving to the poor. And that led him to giving nearly everything away that he earned. Nearly everything. And we read in Malachi chapter 3, verse 8. We'll close with this. "Will a man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. And you say, how have we robbed you? In your tithes and contributions. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and thereby put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you a blessing until there is no more need." And I would say, again, in this passage, he's talking about the tithes and the giving required in the Old Testament. But the principle of robbing God through your giving is something that holds true today. And really, I heard one pastor speaking about this particular passage, and he says, we studied all the cosmological argument for the existence of God and all these different arguments for the existence of God. And he said, here is an argument for the existence of God. Test me in the way that you give, and I will prove myself to you. I will prove my goodness to you through giving and through my blessing to you. And so here's what I want to stop short of saying. I don't want to say that sometimes when you see the word blessing from God, or you see that phrase, blessed is he who does this, you actually, as sinful people, we kind of read into that, God will bless me. Okay, so I'm going to get something that I want. That would be a blessing. So maybe if you're thinking God's going to bless me, he's going to give me more money, right? Not necessarily what's going on in this passage. It's not necessarily give so that you can get more, right? And, maybe what you really need is a health blessing. Maybe you're struggling in your health, and you look at this and you say, okay, if I just give money, God's going to get me better. Well, that's not necessarily what the passage is saying. But God is going to bless you, and he says, test me that I will not open the windows of heaven and pour out that blessing on you. And he says, give, and I will do this. Test me. And so as we close, when it comes to that that time. Really, I'm probably guilty of, I get to a point, I have my own budget set up like we talked about, and I whip out my checkbook and I kind of write the same dollar figure in there because it's kind of the habit I've built up, and Lauren and I talk about it, and okay, well, this is what we're going to do with our giving, and I just essentially pull the check out. It's in the budget. Don't even think about it. There it is. And I can become guilty of giving that tithe and then just really not getting to a place of heart surrender and thinking about maybe I should give more if I have extra, or maybe, I should limit some expenses so that I can give above and beyond. There's so many needs out there. And so, wouldn't it be a great thing that we as a church would get to a place where we are limiting personal expenses so that we can give abundantly, so we can give cheerfully, and that we were just throwing money towards the mission field. We were throwing money and helping people and spreading the gospel through giving, and not just financial giving, but giving of time and resources and other things as well. So, I would say from my perspective, coming from another church and then coming immediately into this church, it was apparent to me in the first couple of weeks that there is very generous giving already in existence in this church. And that is the Lord doing his work in the hearts of people who are here. And I think we should just continue that so much. And we're able to give. Really, I was pretty shocked by the amount that we're able to come up with the size of our congregation for Lottie Moon, and the amount. I think we budget $58,000 to give to the cooperative program. Was 2018, the 2018 budget amount. I think that's a lot of money to give towards missions. That's great. Let's keep it up and let's keep going for it. So I would encourage you, do not fall into that complacent mindset. Tithe, okay, done. Really get to a place of that heart surrender with your finances, and we'll be able to further the gospel even more with that.